There was a time not so long ago when a man's worth felt tied to the ground beneath his feet, to the roof over his head, to the sweat on his brow. It was a simpler time in some ways, but no less cruel when the storms came. And believe me, the storms always came. They'd whip through, tearing down what took years to build, leaving behind a landscape of ruin and regret. In those moments when everything you thought you owned, everything you'd poured your heart into, dissolved like smoke in a strong wind, a funny thing happened. Or maybe it wasn't so funny at all. It was a crossroads, stark and unforgiving, right there in the dust and debris. One path led to a deep, dark well of bitterness, a place where the air grew heavy with self-pity and every memory was twisted into a fresh wound. It was easy to get lost down there, to curl up and let the world pass by, convinced that fate had dealt you a losing hand, that you were nothing but a casualty of forces beyond your control. The system was rigged, the stars conspired against you, and every breath became a quiet complaint. But then there was the other path, a rougher trail, maybe overgrown and forgotten by most, that wound its way up out of the valley. It wasn't about denying the pain, no, not at all. The hurt was real, sharp as broken glass. But this path was about choosing to look at the wreckage not as an end, but as a beginning of something else. It was about finding a single, unbroken brick amidst the rubble and thinking, well, I can lay this one down, and maybe tomorrow I'll find another. It was about the quiet, stubborn refusal to let despair be the last word. This path demanded courage, not just the grand, heroic kind, but the everyday, just keep going kind, especially when no one was watching. It demanded a choice. To be a victim of circumstance or to be the architect, however humble, of your own stubborn recovery. And sometimes, often, that choice didn't just change the man. It changed the very world he lived in, starting with the smallest, most precious part of it. The choice, you see, it always comes. Take Vince, for instance. A man who found himself staring down that very choice, head-on. Vince was 47 years old, though the weariness etched around his deep-set steel-blue eyes often made him look a decade older. 47 years of hauling, lifting, fixing. Mostly on the factory floor these days, for a company that made parts for things he didn't much care about. His build was testament to it. Lean, wiry, not an ounce of wasted flesh on his 510 frame. You could see the sinews ripple under his sun-kissed skin when he moved, the prominent veins tracing maps up his forearms to his thick-palmed hands. Those hands, they were a working man's hands through and through, knuckles a landscape of calluses, faint oil stains ingrained deep in the lines of his skin, nails kept short and practical, bearing the nicks and scrapes of a life spent grappling with metal and machinery. He carried himself with a quiet steadiness, his steps measured, almost deliberate, as if each movement had a purpose and no extra energy was to be expended. His face, rectangular with a strong jawline, usually held a permanent shadow of stubble. Even freshly shaved, it seemed to return quickly, like a ghost of the past day's labor. A small, faded scar arced just above his left eyebrow. A forgotten story from a younger, perhaps wilder time. His dark brown hair, practical and short, was starting to recede just a touch, with a distinguished quarter of gray now flecking the temples, giving him an air of seasoned, quiet wisdom, even if sometimes underneath he felt anything but wise. Vince wasn't much for small talk. He moved through the world with a quiet observation, listening more than he spoke. When he did offer a thought, it came out slowly, thoughtfully, with a slight, almost imperceptible drawl, his words direct, carrying a certain weight, a sense of having been mulled over before being released. He was dependable, all right, solid as the steel he worked with, but guarded. He had a way of looking at you that felt like he saw right through the surface, not in a critical way, but as if he understood the unsaid things. His stoic demeanor was a shield, protecting a deep-seated fear of failing his 12-year-old daughter, Lily, who was the very sun and moon of his existence. Beneath that quiet exterior, there was also a stubborn hope, a quiet ambition he rarely spoke of, to prove himself capable of more than just enduring. His home was a small, two-bedroom house in one of the older, working-class neighborhoods on the edge of town. Modest, certainly, but meticulously kept. You wouldn't find clutter here. Every tool, every book, every knick-knack had its place, reflecting Vince's ingrained effort to keep things together, even when his own world felt like it was coming apart. The paint on the porch might have been a bit faded, the rose bushes a little overgrown, but the windows gleamed, and the lawn was always neatly trimmed. It was a home built on pride and responsibility and a whole lot of elbow grease. Out in the driveway sat his pride and joy, a beat-up but utterly reliable older model pickup truck. It was ancient by some standards, the paint faded in places, a few dents adding character to its working-class charm. But Vince kept it meticulously clean, inside and out, the engine running smooth as a whisper, a testament to his care for what he has, a testament to his belief that even worn-out things deserved respect and diligent maintenance. The pre-dawn quiet in that house rarely lasted long. A shrill, digital squawk from the alarm clock on Vince's nightstand would shatter it just before 5, an unwelcome intrusion that pulled him from the shallow waters of sleep. He didn't hit snooze, never did. There was no time for it, no luxury for an extra 9 minutes of false peace. His lean, sinewy frame, etched with the lines of 47 years of hard labor, would swing out of bed, landing on the cool, worn linoleum of his bedroom floor. Each morning, his reflection in the bathroom mirror showed a man who looked like he'd already worked half a shift. Deep-set steel-blue eyes that seemed to carry the weight of sleepless nights, permanent stubble shadowing a strong jawline and that small, faded scar above his left eyebrow, a forgotten story from a younger, perhaps more reckless Vince. He'd splash cold water on his face, the shock a dull jolt, and begin the silent ritual of getting ready. A quick cup of instant coffee, black and bitter, was gulped down while he packed Lily's lunch. A simple sandwich, an apple, a small bag of chips. Made his own, too. Usually leftovers from dinner, carefully portioned. Every penny mattered, every meal stretched. The factory cafeteria with its overpriced, greasy offerings was a luxury he'd cut years ago. The silence of the kitchen, bathed in the faint, deep blue glow of the gas stove's pilot light, was a heavy thing. He missed the easy chatter, the laughter that used to fill this space before everything went south, before the business folded and took all his savings, all his pride with it. Sometimes a wave of resentment would wash over him, a cold tide of anger at the world, at the system that had promised opportunity and delivered ruin. Betrayed asterisk, that's what he felt. Betrayed and left to pick up the shattered pieces, alone. He'd slip out of the house just as the first hint of pale, warm light began to smudge the eastern sky. The old pickup's engine caught with a familiar growl, a comforting sound in the pre-dawn hush. The commute was short, down streets still sleeping under the streetlights, past other small houses, all dark, all quiet. His mind, however, was rarely quiet. It replayed old conversations, old decisions, old mistakes, each one a fresh thorn in his side. He'd gripped the steering wheel, his thick palms and calloused knuckles, ingrained with faint oil stains, tightening as if to wrestle control back from a fate that seemed determined to run him into the ground. The factory floor was a cacophony of banging metal, whirring machinery, and the distant shouts of supervisors by the time Vince clocked in. The air hung thick with the smell of metal dust and cutting oil. His station, a hydraulic press on the assembly line, was a beast of a machine. Day in and day out, he loaded raw steel sheets, activated the press, and watched as the heavy die stamped out identical parts. It was mind-numbing work, the kind that wore down a man's spirit if he let it, but Vince had learned to detach, to let his body work while his mind drifted, often to Lily, sometimes to the gnawing fear that he wasn't doing enough, that he never would be. Small frustrations were a constant companion. A jammed press, a batch of substandard material, a new hire who couldn't keep up. Each was a fresh spark for the simmering anger he tried to keep caged. He saw other guys, younger ones, laughing, planning weekend trips, and a bitter envy would twist in his gut. They didn't know what it felt like to be underwater, to be clinging to the surface by sheer will. His mind, despite the repetitive clatter of the press, was rarely quiet. It was a battlefield where memories of what he once had clashed with the harsh reality of what he'd become. He remembered the smell of sawdust, not metal filings. The satisfying weight of a custom-built cabinet, not a stamped piece of steel. His own shop, Vince's Woodworks, had been more than just a business. It was the echo of a dream, whispered to him by his own father, a carpenter himself, long since passed. He could almost feel the smooth grain of cherry. Under his calloused fingertips, smell the resin and the careful polish. Instead, the relentless thrum of the factory floor vibrated through his very bones, a constant, grating reminder of how far he'd fallen. Another day done, another shift punched, another step on the long, hard road that felt less like a path and more like a treadmill. When the whistle finally shrieked its freedom call, Vince was already moving, his lean frame cutting through the emptying aisles with a purpose that often bordered on grim determination. He didn't linger for small talk, didn't crack jokes with the younger lads. His thoughts were his own, tangled like old fishing line, and he preferred to unravel them in the quiet solitude of his old pickup. The sun was just beginning its descent. painting the factory walls in a sickly orange glow as he rumbled out of the lot, heading for home. Home was a small, neat house, tucked away on a street where the trees were old and the neighbors knew each other's rhythms. He pulled the meticulously clean, though aged, truck into the driveway, the engine ticking softly as it cooled. The smell of something vaguely cooking, probably Lily's attempt at macaroni and cheese, drifted from the open kitchen window. He pushed open the screen door, the familiar creak a small comfort in a world that offered few. "Dad, is that you?" Lily's voice, still holding that sweet, untroubled lilt of childhood, called from deeper in the house. "It's me, kiddo," he grunted back, tossing his lunch pail onto the counter. He peeled off his work shirt, revealing the sinewy strength of his arms, the prominent veins tracing paths beneath his sun-kissed skin. His eyes, deep-set and steel blue, scanned the tidy kitchen. Lily had clearly been busy. Her homework sat spread across the dining table, a half-eaten apple beside a math textbook. He poured himself a mug of lukewarm coffee, left from the morning, and leaned against the counter, the weariness settling into his bones. His mind drifted back to the factory, to the endless cycle, the feeling of being trapped. Betrayed asterisk, that was the word that kept coming back. Betrayed by the market, by his suppliers, by luck itself. The bitterness curdled in his gut like bad milk. He swallowed hard, trying to push it down, but it was always there, a permanent shadow in the corners of his vision. Just then his old rotary phone, a relic he refused to replace, shrilled from the wall. Vince pushed off the counter, his jawline hardening, a familiar tension knotting in his shoulders. He knew the ringtone by heart these days. He picked it up, his thick palms gripping the receiver, the faded oil stains on his knuckles showing clear. "It's Miller," he said, his voice clipped, a slight drawl underlying the steel. He listened for a moment, his eyes narrowing, the fine lines around them deepening. "Look, I told you folks last week. There's nothing left. Bankruptcy ain't a game, it's a fact. You want blood from a stone." His voice rose, a sharp edge cutting through the quiet hum of the house. "My shop, my savings, everything's gone. You think I got a secret stash? I'm working double shifts just to keep the lights on for God. On God's green earth. Don't you dare tell me I ain't doing enough." The silence that followed was heavy, thick with the weight of unshed tears and unspoken threats. A click, then the dull hum of the dial tone. Vince slammed the receiver back into its cradle with a thud that echoed in the small kitchen. His chest heaved, his steel blue eyes, usually so guarded, now held a raw, flickering anger. He leaned his thick palms against the worn countertop, knuckles white, the ingrained oil stains on his skin stark against the pale laminate. The house was quiet again, a deep, unsettling quiet that pressed in on him like the walls of a tomb. Moonlight, thin and cold, sliced through the window over the sink, painting the floor in shades of gray and bruised purple. The air held the faint, lingering smell of old coffee and a faint metallic tang from the factory dust that seemed to cling to his clothes no matter how many times he washed them. He pushed off the counter, running a calloused hand over his short, practical hair, the gray at his temples catching the pale light. 47. He felt 100. This wasn't the life he'd envisioned, not when he was building his shop with his own two hands, dreaming of a future where Lily would never want for anything. Now he was back to punching a clock, the factory floor a grim reminder of where he'd started and where he'd seemingly returned. A circle, but not one of completion or satisfaction, more like a snare tightening with each passing day. He walked to the living room, the old floorboards groaning under his lean frame. The couch was an old hand-me-down, comfortable but sagging in the middle. He didn't sit. He just stood there, staring out the window at the sleeping street, at the other small, well-maintained houses that looked just like his. Each one a fortress against the unknown, but his felt like a paper-thin wall against an ocean. What had his life become? A long, slow grind. He worked shifts that blurred into one another, his body aching with the rhythm of the machines, his mind numb with the repetition. The pride he once took in his craftsmanship, in fixing things, felt like a distant memory, replaced by the hollow satisfaction of making it through another day without a breakdown, literal or metaphorical. He was a factory worker again, just a cog easily replaced. The bitterness, it wasn't just in his gut anymore, it seeped into his bones, a dull ache that never truly subsided. He felt betrayed not just by the market or by bad luck, but by the very idea of striving for something. What was the point when it could all be stripped away so easily? The system, fate, God, he felt they'd all ganged up on him, left him out in the cold with nothing but the clothes on his back and a mountain of debt. A deep sigh escaped him, rough and ragged. He glanced at the framed photo on the small side table, Lily beaming her arm around him, her bright eyes so full of innocent trust. That image usually brought a flicker of warmth, but tonight it only sharpened the fear. The raw, guttural fear of failing her. He'd de-promised her the world, or at least a stable corner of it, and now he was struggling just to keep the lights on, struggling to pretend everything was all right when the walls felt like they were closing in. He kept so much inside, that was his way. His pride, a stubborn mule, wouldn't let him ask for help, not even from the few friends who'd offered. He'd just grunt, change the subject, or simply disappear for a while. Sometimes in these long, dark hours, a secret hope would try to worm its way in, a whisper of a different future. Maybe a small workshop again, just for himself, tinkering with engines. Maybe a way to get out from under the debt, to breathe freely again. But then the calls from collectors, the empty bank account, the endless shifts, they'd stomp on it, smothering it until only the bitterness remained. He was a survivor, yes, but what kind of life was this, just surviving? Just treading water until he drowned. The thought was a lead weight in his stomach. He wasn't just a victim of circumstances, he realized in the cold honesty of 3 a.m. He was a victim of his own resentment, of his own stubborn refusal to see anything beyond the immediate wreckage. He didn't know how to get out of it, or if he even wanted to anymore. He just knew the next day would come, and he'd have to put on the mask again. For Lily, always for Lily, always for Lily. He'd just come home, the worn-out smell of factory grease clinging to his clothes even after a quick scrub. The day's grime still somehow etched into the lines of his thick, calloused hands. The late afternoon sunlight, softened to a pale gold, spilled through the window of his small kitchen, painting stripes across the worn linoleum floor and touching the tidy, if outdated, appliances. He was pouring a glass of water, the quiet hum of the old refrigerator the only sound, when the landline, sitting on the small, chipped counter, jolted to life with a shrill ring. His jaw tightened, a familiar clench. He didn't need to see the caller ID, his gut knew. Another one. They always came when he was least prepared, when he was just trying to catch his breath. Taking a slow, deep breath that did little to calm the knot in his stomach, he picked up the receiver, turning his back to the hallway, trying to project an air of calm he didn't feel. His voice, usually a slow, steady drawl, was clipped quiet. "Vince, yeah, I'm here." He listened, the collector's smooth, insistent tone a familiar assault on his already frayed nerves. His answers were short, almost grunts, his steel-blue eyes fixed on a scratch on the kitchen wall, imagining it to be the face of his misfortune. He felt the familiar heat of resentment build, a bitter taste in his mouth. They didn't understand. They couldn't possibly know what it felt like to have everything you built crumble, to lose years of sweat and savings. The system had failed him, hadn't it? The world had taken its shot, and he was just standing there, trying not to fall over. A soft shuffle caught his attention. He didn't turn, didn't want to break the precarious calm of his voice. But he saw it anyway, a shadow falling across the doorway, then a small figure, still wearing her school uniform, standing just out of sight. Lily, his daughter, all 12 years of her, with her bright, watchful eyes. He kept talking, trying to keep his voice even, to sound in control, but he knew she was listening. He could feel her presence like a small, silent weight. He could feel the words he wasn't saying hanging in the air, the desperation he was trying so hard to hide. Finally, he gave a non-committal response, a promise to call back next week, a promise he already knew he couldn't keep, and hung up with a quiet, deliberate click. He turned slowly, the receiver still in his hand, and his gaze met hers. Lily stood there, her small shoulders a little hunched, her face a canvas of quiet understanding. There was no anger, no accusation, just a deep-seated worry in her deep-set eyes that mirrored his own, yet somehow amplified it. A fine line, barely visible, was etched between her brows, a sign of the burden she was silently shouldering. She didn't have to say a word. The fear, the unspoken question in her gaze, hit him like a physical blow. In that instant, the bitterness, the anger, the years of self-pity that had become his constant companion, all of it curdled and died. He saw himself, truly saw himself, reflected in her worried face. Not the stoic, reliable father he tried to be, but a man drowning in his own despair, letting it spill over and touch the one person he swore to protect. He wasn't just hurting himself with his resentment, he was hurting her. He was teaching her that when things went wrong, you curled up, you blamed the world, and you let the fear eat at you. A quiet enough settled in his chest. Not a roar, not a dramatic declaration, but a profound, silent decision that vibrated through his very bones. It was a choice made in the muted gold of his simple kitchen, watching the worry in his daughter's eyes. He didn't know what he would do or how he would do it. The path ahead was still obscured by the same debt and the same hard reality. But he knew with a certainty that was both terrifying and liberating that something, everything, had to change. He couldn't be a victim anymore. Not for her. He just couldn't. The quiet enough that settled in Vince's chest wasn't a sudden burst of sunshine. It was more like the slow, grinding turn of a rusted gear, reluctant but resolute. The house fell still again after Lily had gone to bed, leaving him with the lingering scent of her lavender shampoo and the heavy silence of his own making. He sat there at the kitchen table, the dim glow from the range hood catching the faint oil stains ingrained in his calloused hands, the stark reality of his situation still pressing down. The vow to change, born in that poignant moment, felt immense, almost impossible, like trying to push a mountain with his bare hands. The next morning, the exhaustion was still a thick blanket. His dark brown hair with its 25% gray at the temples was neat as always, but his deep-set steel-blue eyes carried the weight of a sleepless night. The factory floor with its familiar clang and hum offered no immediate comfort. He moved through his shift like a ghost, his gaze observing the rhythmic dance of machinery, his thoughts a tangled mess of what-ifs and how-nows. The bitterness, like a stubborn weed, tried to sprout again, whispering insidious thoughts of unfairness and wasted effort. He'd catch himself, his strong jaw tightening, his gaze drifting to the grimy window overlooking the industrial park. No, not anymore. Lunch break came, a precious sliver of quiet in the loud factory. He sat in his usual corner of the break room, the fluorescent lights casting a harsh glare on his sun-kissed skin. Co-workers chatted about weekend plans, fishing trips, car troubles. Vince picked at his sandwich, the food tasteless in his mouth. He overheard Frank, the floor manager, sighing to another supervisor about a Saturday overtime shift. "Can't find anyone willing to put in the hours," Frank grumbled, rubbing his temple. "Everyone's got plans." The words snagged Vince's attention like a burr. His first instinct, the old, resentful instinct, was to scoff. More hours. For what? To feed the machine that chewed you up and spat you out. His pride bristled, still raw from the bankruptcy, from feeling like a profound failure. He had worked so hard, put in so many extra shifts before, only for it all to crumble beneath him. The thought of volunteering for more asterisk physical labor, more monotony, after a long week and no real sense of reward, made his sinewy frame ache just thinking about it. He wanted to curl up, to retreat, to nurse his wounds in the dark. He almost let the moment pass, almost stayed silent, letting the comfortable shroud of self-pity envelop him once more. Then Lily's face, not the worried face from the night before, but her face from a few weeks back, carefully drawing a picture of a little house with a green roof, a hopeful, childlike vision. He remembered her asking if they'd ever live in a house like that again. A pang, sharp and clean, went through him. His vow echoed in his mind, clear as a bell. Not for me, maybe. But for her, I have to choose differently. He swallowed the last bite of his sandwich, the bread suddenly tasting like sawdust. He pushed himself up from the table, his lean, wiry frame uncoiling slowly. His knuckles, thick and calloused, clenched briefly. He walked over to where Frank was standing, looking tired. "Frank!" Vince's voice, usually a low murmur, was a little rougher than usual, carrying that slight drawl. Frank looked up, surprised, his eyes taking in Vince's steady gaze. Vince rarely spoke out of turn unless it was important. "That Saturday shift you mentioned." He paused, a momentary tremor of his old pride battling his new resolve. He could feel his heart thrumming in his chest, a strange mix of dread and determination. "I'll take it." Frank blinked, then a slow smile spread across his face, not a wide grin, but a knowing, tired kind of smile. "Well, I'll be." "Didn't think you had it in you, Vince? Extra hours for you usually meant a trip to the dentist." Vince almost chuckled. It was true. His old self would have found any excuse to avoid more time in the dusty, deafening factory. "Times change, Frank. I'll take it." Frank nodded, his eyes meeting Vince's with a hint of respect. "Consider it yours, startin' this Saturday. Consider it yours." Vince nodded, the news settling over him like a warm blanket after a long, cold night. The extra shifts, the grind, the early mornings, they used to feel like a heavy chain around his ankle, dragging him deeper into the quicksand of his life. But now it was different. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about building brick by painful brick. The first few extra shifts were tough, sure. His old bones ached, his eyes stung from the dust and the fluorescent glare. Found himself still clenching his jaw, the ghost of old resentments trying to whisper in his ear. "This isn't fair. Why me?" But each time he'd catch himself. He'd picture Lily's face, that quiet, knowing worry in her deep-set eyes, and the whispers would fade. He'd push through, focusing on the rhythmic clang of the presses, the precise movements of his calloused hands on the machinery. He wasn't just turning a wrench, he was turning the page. And then, around the third week, something shifted. It wasn't a sudden burst of sunshine, more like the stubborn gray clouds finally beginning to thin, letting just a sliver of light touch the horizon. He still came home exhausted, the lines around his steel blue eyes a little deeper, the faint oil stains ingrained in his thick palms a little darker. But the exhaustion wasn't the same. It was a good ache, the kind that came from honest effort, not from the soul-sapping weight of self-pity. One Tuesday morning, old Stan, who'd been on the floor longer than Vince had been alive, stopped him by the time clock. Stan was a man of few words, mostly grunts and observations about the weather. But he fixed Vince with a squinty gaze, a look that cut straight through the usual factory hum. "You lookin', less like a drowned rat, Vince. What's the secret? Finally gettin' some sleep?" Vince just offered a slight, almost imperceptible shrug, a faint shadow of a smile playing on his lips. His permanent stubble seemed to soften with the gesture. "Just keepin' busy, Stan." He didn't elaborate, didn't need to. Stan, like an old oak, knew when to simply observe the changing seasons. The change wasn't just visible to others, Vince felt it in his bones. The air in his small, well-maintained house seemed to breathe a little easier. He still drove his reliable, older model pickup, kept meticulously clean, but now he'd whistle a low tune sometimes on the way home, something he hadn't done in years. The evenings, once a silent battle against his own spiraling thoughts, became moments of quiet purpose. Lily, his bright, observant Lily, was the first to truly mirror the shift back to him. One evening, she was hunched over her homework at the small kitchen table, the same table where he'd held his. The same table where he'd held his head in his hands more times than he cared to remember, lost in the thorny thicket of numbers and notices. Now Vince was at the stove, stirring a simple pot of chili, the rich, savory scent filling the small kitchen. It wasn't fancy, but it was from scratch, a deliberate choice over the frozen meals that had become the norm during his darkest days. The late afternoon sun, a comforting mix of gold and peach, slanted through the window, warming the worn linoleum floor. Lily looked up from her math book, her brow furrowed, not with worry for him anymore, but with the universal struggle of fractions. She watched her dad for a moment, her bright eyes tracking the steady rhythm of his spoon. "Dad?" she asked, her voice soft, tentative. Vince turned, a faint smile touching the corners of his mouth, a quiet ease in his deep-set steel blue eyes that hadn't been there before. "Yeah, Bug. Are we okay?" she whispered, the question hanging in the air, a ghost of her past fear. He walked over to the table, pulling out a chair and sitting across from her. His thick palms rested on the worn wood, calloused knuckles showing clear. He looked at her, truly looked, and saw not just a scared child, but a resilient young girl who had endured his silence and sorrow alongside him. "We are, Lilybug," he said slowly, his voice a low rumble, direct and steady. "We're more than okay. We're building brick by brick, you and me." He didn't offer grand promises, no easy fixes, just the hard, honest truth of their new reality. That was his promise now. Not a quick escape, but a steadfast climb. The silence that followed wasn't heavy or anxious, but warm, filled with the promise of the simmering chili and the gentle hum of the old refrigerator. Lily gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, a tiny smile blossoming on her face. She picked up her pencil again, but the tension in her shoulders had eased. For Vince, those bricks were small, everyday choices. He still worked his long shifts at the factory, the familiar clang of machinery a constant companion. His body, lean and wiry, still ached at the end of the day, but now it was an ache of accomplishment, not despair. He started taking on some extra odd jobs on weekends, fixing a neighbor's leaky faucet, helping Stan with a fence repair. Small tasks, yes, but each one brought in a little extra, chipping away at the lingering shadow of debt, a tangible mark of progress. He wasn't just asterisk existing anymore, he was actively managing. The messy stack of bills on the corner of the kitchen counter had been replaced by a small, neat ledger carefully updated each evening. He'd sit there, in the quiet glow of a single lamp, his sun-kissed skin catching the light, going over numbers, making meticulous plans. He taught himself basic budgeting software, not with the old resentment for having to learn it, but with a quiet determination to master every tool at his disposal. Each balanced column, each planned payment was a small victory, a quiet defiance against the chaos that had once consumed him. His pride, that stubborn flaw that made asking for help so hard, hadn't vanished entirely, but it had softened. He found himself chatting more with Stan during breaks, not about his troubles, but about finding a better deal on lumber for a project, or tips for engine maintenance on his old pickup. He even shared a story about Lily's latest school play, a genuine chuckle rumbling in his chest. It wasn't a confession of weakness, but a quiet acknowledgement of shared humanity, a subtle opening of the guarded door he'd kept shut for so long. He'd started a small vegetable patch in the backyard, something he'd always wanted to do but never had the heart for. Now, tending to the stubborn seedlings in the cool morning air, his calloused hands carefully turning the soil, felt like a metaphor for his own life. Each tiny sprout, each green leaf reaching for the sun was a testament to patience, to careful nurturing, to the belief that something good could still grow from barren ground. Lily, often shy and reserved, sometimes joined him, her small hands digging alongside his, sharing in the quiet labor, planting seeds not just in the earth, but in their shared future. Bankruptcy ain't the end, he'd sometimes think to himself, watching Lily laugh as she chased a butterfly near the fledgling tomato plants. It's just a damn hard fork in the road. You can sit there and curse the whole world, or you can pick yourself up, learn from the mess, and build something new, even if it's just brick by brick. For my kid, he'd muse, feeling the warmth of the sun on his face, a quiet resolve settling deep in his chest. It wasn't always like this. There'd been months after the paperwork was signed and the last of the business was gone, when the air around him had felt thick with resentment. Every creak of the old house, every bill in the mail, every distant laugh from a neighbor had felt like a personal affront. He'd retreated into himself, a fortress of self-pity, the strong jawline often clenched, his deep-set steel-blue eyes clouded with a bitterness that tasted metallic on his tongue. He'd come home from the factory, the din of the machines still ringing in his ears, and just exist. The tidy kitchen, usually a place of quiet order, had felt heavy, an oppressive silence filling the spaces where his daughter's chatter used to be met with his own mumbled replies. The sun-kissed skin of his face felt drawn, the fine lines around his eyes etched deeper not by laughter but by worry. Then came the phone call. He'd been in the kitchen, arguing in hushed but furious tones with a debt collector, the kind of conversation that left a man feeling smaller than he was. He thought Lily was upstairs, lost in her books. But as he hung up, the receiver thudding back into its cradle with a finality that echoed his own despair, he turned. There she stood, just inside the doorway, her small frame almost lost in the late afternoon shadows filtering through the window. Her usually bright eyes, wide and searching, held a raw worry that punched him harder than any financial ruin ever could. He saw his own fear reflected there, amplified, innocent, and utterly heartbreaking. It wasn't just his asterisk mess anymore. It was her burden too, a weight settling on her young shoulders because he'd been too consumed by his own wounded pride to truly fight. That was the turn. That was the damn hard fork. He looked at her, truly looked, and the victim mentality, the anger at fate, it just shriveled. His stubborn hope buried deep beneath the rubble of his business had flickered back to life, fueled by the terrifying prospect of failing asterisk her. He couldn't just sit there and curse the world. He had to pick himself up. For Lily, the change hadn't been a sudden explosion, more like the slow, steady hum of a well-maintained engine. He started with small things. The vegetable patch, yes, but also the meticulous cleaning of his old pickup, the one with the faint oil stains ingrained in his calloused hands from years of working it, making it shine as if it were brand new. He started listening more at the factory, observing the younger guys, offering a quiet word of advice now and then, his words carrying a new kind of weight, direct and thoughtful. His guarded demeanor began to soften, just barely. The permanent shadow stubble on his face seemed to frame a more thoughtful expression now. He'd found a night class at the community college, learning about small business management, not because he was dreaming of a grand new venture yet, but because he wanted to understand asterisk why things had gone wrong, to arm himself with knowledge. The thought of asking for help, something his pride used to revolt against, felt different now. He was humble, focused, no longer battling unseen enemies but building brick by painful brick. One evening, Lily was helping him sort through old tools in the shed, her dark brown hair, so like his own, glinting in the warm light of the single bulb. She picked up a rusty wrench, her brow furrowed. "Dad," she asked, her voice soft, "will we be okay?" He straightened up, brushing dust from his thick palms. His steel-blue eyes, clear now, met hers. A small, faded scar above his left eyebrow crinkled as he offered a rare, gentle smile. "Lilybug," he began, his voice a slight drawl, deliberate and steady. "We ain't just gonna be okay, we're gonna be better, stronger." He knelt down, his sinewy frame surprisingly nimble. "Bankruptcy ain't the end, kiddo, it's just a damn hard fork in the road." He paused, looking at the wrench in her hand. You can sit there and curse the whole world, feel sorry for yourself, let the rust take over. Or, he gently took the wrench, demonstrating how to wipe it clean with a rag. You can pick yourself up, learn from the mess, and build something new, even if it's just brick by brick. He met her gaze again, the quiet ambition in his eyes burning brighter than before. And for my kid, I had to choose the latter, always. Lily nodded slowly, a quiet understanding dawning in her eyes. She reached for another rusty tool, a small, determined glint reflecting the warm light.